The following show is brought to you in partnership with the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History, Blue Star Strategies, Bright Road Incorporated, Make It Plain Podcast, and RPC Media.
From the campus of the University of the District of Columbia, this is State of Play.
Welcome to State of Play. I'm Sharon Pratt, and with me are Karen Tramontano and the Reverend Mark Thompson. Our topic today, the first 100 days of the presidency of Joe Biden. We're doing it from a historical context, and we have, very fortunately, Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. He is the James McDonald Distinguished University Professor for African American Studies and the Chair of African American Studies at Princeton University. It's an honor to have you with us.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
You've written many books on the struggle of African Americans in this country, and particularly the Black Power movement. The recent one, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and its urgent lessons for our own. Why particularly that focus and topic, and does it inform us for where we are?
Absolutely. You know, I found myself with the election of Donald Trump facing despair and disillusionment. I kept asking myself the question, you know, what does it mean that they've done this again? They've done it again. And so I reached for Jimmy Baldwin for resources because Baldwin had experienced his own sense of despair and disillusionment after the assassination of Dr. King. He had to try to figure out how to pick up the pieces, not only of himself, but of the country. What does it mean that in this moment where the country had an opportunity to imagine itself as a genuinely multiracial democracy, that it doubled down on this belief that it must be a white nation in the vein of old Europe? And here we are in our own moment. So I reached for Baldwin to think with him about how we might run towards our fears and imagine ourselves otherwise. So Baldwin helped me kind of pick up the pieces, as it were, of myself, and in some ways to help think about the country and its current crises now.
So as someone who can provide us the historical arc, particularly on this important topic, and the challenges, therefore, for President Biden, where are we? I mean, are we at a just continuing struggle? Because we've been at it for 400 years. Or are we at an inflection point in a significant way?
I think we're in an inflection point. The age of Reagan is collapsing. All of its pillars are collapsing in front of us. Its conception of government, its understanding of taxes, its understanding of the role of markets in relation to the public sector and our imagining of the public good, its understanding of policing. The age of Reagan is collapsing because the evidence is in that it's bankrupt. And part of that collapse means that we have to figure out how we're going to do democracy in this country. And particularly, how will we do democracy shorn of the noxious belief that white people are valued more than others, that Black people can be treated with a generalized sense of disregard? That's the inflection point. And it seems to me that if we don't get it right at this moment, we may very well seal our fate there.
Professor, given the pandemic, the economic collapse, the Black Lives Matter movement, all that the Trump presidency destroyed, is President Biden in an unprecedented position right now?
In some ways, yes, because he's unprecedented because he's there. You know, he's never been in this position before, right? And the country faces something that I think that we haven't seen since the Civil War. That the very possibility of American democracy is in question, you see. And what I mean by that is this: not only over these 100 days have we had to pay attention to the policy initiatives, which he's tried to respond to at scale, because he has to respond to the crisis at scale, right? But at the same time, that there are those things that he had to do that we're not paying attention to. He had to rebuild state. He had to rebuild the Justice Department. He had to deal with the corruption that define interior, right? Because remember, we forget that one of the buckets that Steve Bannon told us was to deconstruct the administrative state. And so he has to get government working again, on top of putting forward policies to address the substantive crisis that we face. So there have been some disappointments, but I understand the scale of what's in front of him. It is unprecedented in my view, but we've had unprecedented moments before.
Professor Glaude, what does it mean for Biden to have organized a meeting with historians, including you, a Baldwin historian at that? What does it mean for him to have done that? And what does that say about him?
Well, he understands the significance of the moment, that this is a presidency in a time of transition, in a time of crisis, at an inflection point, to use the mayor's language. But he also understands, I think, at least maybe I'm projecting here, Brother Mark, that history is in us, you see. That history is not something that's just in the past. It actually constitutes funded experience that comes to us as we try to act in the present. So the kinds of choices that Lincoln made, the kind of choices that FDR made, the kind of choices that Johnson made, but more importantly, the mistakes they made in the face of their crises, right, ought to, or at least should, inform how he imagines responding to our crisis. He can't duplicate those presidencies. He has to be his own, but he can also, take part of the wisdom that they offer, it seems to me. And that's a good thing.
What do you think President Biden is anticipating doing and can do so that we can navigate our way through this difficult time to a better circumstance in America?
Mayor Pratt, I don't focus so much on what he can do. I focus on what we must do. And it seems to me that our charge in this moment is to imagine America differently in our on-the-ground work, that the swell from below, as Ella Baker would insist upon, will push him to be the kind of president we need in this moment. And so that's where my faith resides. I'm not, shall we say, he's not my guiding star. We are, if that makes sense.
It helps us to understand where we find President Biden, to have your insights and your reflections. And we can't thank you enough for being on State of Play.
Thank you so much. And y'all take care. Stay safe.
Now, after just 100 days, I can report to the nation, America is on the move again.
Welcome back to State of Play. Karen, Mark, and I are reflecting on the first 100 days of the presidency of Joe Biden. And we three decided that we want to put it in historical context. But it was interesting that the three presidents we decided to look at are Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Lyndon Baines Johnson. Three presidents who were very consequential. And it would appear that Joe Biden wants to be a president of consequence as well. In the past, he might have been the good Joe Biden, but now, strategically, I think he's decided to go for broke.
Well, Mayor, I think you're right. And I also think he has no choice. Like the other presidents you mentioned, he is confronted by a near economic collapse, obviously a pandemic, civil rights movement as the result of violence on Black bodies. He is also looking at history and wants to understand history in a way that our previous president did not. And also he has the burden of restoring our institutions that for the past 4 years had been destroyed. So I think he is focused on making democracy work for the people because he has to.
Certainly, Karen. And I think that if we were to do a Venn diagram, we would find that each of the critical issues Lincoln, FDR, and LBJ faced in their administrations, Biden to some extent is facing today in a modern context. So he may have even more on his plate overall And I agree with you, Mayor. I think that's what he wants to do. He wants to be a president of consequence. He has, unlike Trump, who touted Andrew Jackson, Biden has a picture of FDR hanging. And it's interesting, whenever there's a White House gaggle in the Oval Office, over his left shoulder is the bust of Bobby Kennedy, who, after all, wasn't elected president, but obviously was someone who wanted to be president with great ambition. The last president didn't want to get up and go to work every morning. He didn't want to even function. It is a job that you get paid for. Biden, I think, wants to show and prove that he's able to do that with all of the issues that he's facing right now.
He's got a very full plate. And I think that Joe Biden, who ran for president twice before, might have been a very different kind of president. But after serving 8 years with Obama and recognizing what Obama could do, but how quickly you can lose your political capital, I think that's one other reason that he says, I'm going to, go for broke. And I think he also appreciates the perilous moment we're in America. After all, in the wake of his presidency, we had an insurrection on the 6th of January. So I think he understands, where we are in this country. And I think let's hope he is the right person for this time.
And Mayor, this is, Joe Biden's been around for a long time. So he has a vision of what he wants to accomplish, how he wants to accomplish. And as you said, he served for 8 years under President Obama. And I think he saw where political capital wasn't leveraged the way it could have been. And I just don't think he's going to miss an opportunity.
Well, we're going to have Professor Kate Mazur come up and talk to us about Abraham Lincoln. And that's interesting that we make that comparison in terms of trying to keep the Union together. January 6th suggests that is also a challenge for President Joe Biden. So don't go away. Stay with State of Play. Welcome back to State of Play. As you know, our topic today is the first 100 days of President Joe Biden. And to help us get a better grasp of that, particularly in terms of historical context, we have Professor Kate Mazur. She's Associate Professor of History at Northwestern University. Delighted to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, you've written many books. Most of your focus has been in the period of Abraham Lincoln. And you have a recent book, Until Justice Be Done. And that's a fascinating story that you're telling there. Could you elaborate on it?
My new book, Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction, illuminates the history of a little-known movement for racial equality and civil rights, mostly in the antebellum North, in which Black activists, white people kind of came together to make demands for racial equality, for the elimination of racist laws that actually still existed in the North, and the protection of the civil rights of African Americans. And I show how this movement developed over time from the American Revolution all the way up until the Civil War and Reconstruction, and how it really shaped our first federal civil rights measures. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, which was the first federal civil rights statute, and the 14th Amendment itself. And
this energy, this excitement existed primarily in the North. And what was the sort of catalyst or inspiration for it?
Well, there are a variety of fights that these people were taking up. In the northern states of places like Ohio and Illinois actually had explicitly racially discriminatory laws that barred Black people from testifying in court cases involving whites, that reserved schools for white children only. And so they were fighting against those laws at the state level, arguing that the states needed to repeal these laws and treat everyone equally, regardless of race. And so that's one example of the kind of struggle that they were waging. And they made their way from the margins of politics into the center, so that by the time Lincoln was elected president in 1860, this agenda of racial equality before the law was really part of the Republican Party's overall agenda. And we see the Republicans bringing that vision into politics during the Civil War and Reconstruction.
So you had the Whigs and the Democrats, and then now you have the Republicans with this more progressive agenda. So these economic, social movements, and maybe even fissures within our society in 1860, do you see anything that parallels what we're experiencing today for President Joe Biden?
Well, this is a country that has had slavery and questions about what happens when you end race-based slavery at the center of our history from the very beginning. And so the struggle that I talk about in the North was in many ways about coming to grips with a post-slavery North. And the tools that people brought into government in the 1860s were the product of coming to grips with the end of slavery and questions of racial equality in the North. And this was a party, the Republican Party, that was looking south to people, slaveholders and their allies who were intensely committed not only to discriminating against free Black people, but to enslaving people. And so the tensions that they faced to the point of, the secession of 11 Southern states and their attempt to form their own separate nation was very much about these questions of what was the future of the nation going to look like when it came to questions of slavery itself, but also racial justice.
But in many ways, was not the argument around prerogative as well? I mean, whether you have a strong federal government or whether the states have the last word, is that parallel to some of the tensions of today, including, do you have a right to tell me to wear a mask?
Well, absolutely. I mean, sometimes people argue that the Southerners were fighting for quote unquote states' rights. And, if anything, they were fighting for the states' rights to continue to have slavery, to legalize slavery. So it was really the substance of the fight was not states' rights versus federal power, but was really the question of the future of slavery. But still within that were questions about the role of the federal government in ensuring people's rights, the power of the federal government to override the prerogatives of the so-called states, by which they meant the voters of the states. And so today, when we see arguments about, for instance, mask mandates, whether states can pursue mask mandates, or questions about the right to vote, where we see in many states efforts to restrict and limit people's access to the vote. And the question is, to what extent can the federal government intervene there and say, you can't go beyond a certain point in making it difficult for people to vote, or we need to protect the public health, so we need to have everyone wearing masks, regardless of what your state government happens to want to do. These are very live questions now to this day.
But when Lincoln was elected, he did not want anything to happen to interrupt the Union. I mean, he had very aspirational language. He was a wonderful orator. But at the end of the day, he was a pragmatist. How do you see Biden in comparison or contrast?
Well, I think we're going to see Biden acting very pragmatically. What else can he really do when faced with particularly a closely divided Senate and the issue of the tradition of the filibuster? And so there may be all kinds of things that Biden wants truly in his heart that he is going to know he's got to make deals and kind of maybe reduce expectations a little bit if he wants to get these things through the Senate. But I think it's important to remember that in our constitutional system of government, the president doesn't have all the power. And so what actually happens in the Senate in coming months is going to be pivotal. What happens with moderate Senate Democrats, which way are they going to go? Are they going to overrule the kind of tradition of the filibuster that has been so often used to undermine American democracy? These are questions that are going to be settled not by Biden himself, but within the Senate. And we're going to have to see what transpires there.
Well, Lincoln figured out how to get everybody on board for the 13th Amendment. Let me ask you, did you come away from all your studies admiring him?
I do admire Lincoln. I think I would have been on the side of the abolitionists. I hope I would have, saying, hurry up, let's do emancipation. Let's, here are Black men wanting to volunteer for the fight. Let's let them volunteer and kind of move forward quickly with abolition. And Lincoln was slow, and to the frustration of people like Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists. At the same time, though, he was facing, as president, so many different delicate situations. He needed to keep Kentucky and Maryland in particular from seceding from the Union. And so he was playing his cards very carefully. And, in the end, one example, after issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, he stuck to his guns, right? He was under so much pressure to repeal it, to go back on it. And he really went out and defended it. And from there moved in the direction by the end of his life of supporting African Americans' men's right to vote. And so overall, Lincoln was a pragmatic, but a leader but also someone who showed that he could change with the moment and adapt his expectations to the moment he was facing. I think that's going to be critical for President Biden.
Well, you did say that there were comparisons, there are parallels, but not nearly as dramatic for Biden as it was for Lincoln. But granted, when Lincoln won, the country immediately moved to splintering. When Biden won, you had an insurrection unheard of on the 6th of January. So maybe not there yet, but I think some 40% of voting Republicans supported the insurrection. I mean, what does that bode for Biden?
That's very troubling. And what we've seen recently from certain quarters of the Republican Party and continuing to deny the legitimacy of Biden's election and continuing to challenge the results of the election, which have been verified in so many ways by bipartisan election officials in the states. And I know from talking to people, there are a number of proposals out there for things like revitalizing civics education, for helping people with media literacy, for really helping people to, come to grips with the media environment that we're in now, which is so where voices have proliferated in so many different ways, and people have a difficult time making sense of what is true and what is not. And so I think that's another front that we really need to look at is kind of revitalizing our civics and really helping people to understand how to make sense of where we are in this nation right now.
Well, you've been very helpful. It does help to get a grasp of what happened before. So thank you very much, Professor Mazur, for being here on State of Play.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome back to State of Play. As you know, our topic today is the first 100 days of President Joe Biden's presidency. And to help us put it in historical context, we have a great guest today, Professor Eric Rauchway, who is the professor of history at the University of California at Davis. Thank you so much for being a part of State of Play today.
Thanks for having me.
And you have done a lot of work around Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and your recent book is Why the New Deal Matters. Why does the New Deal matter?
Well, I think the New Deal matters for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think we don't appreciate the extent to which it's part of our everyday lives. If we undertake any kind of financial transaction, if we take out a mortgage, if we drive down the street, if we turn on the power, if we join a union, if we take out a small business loan, we're dealing in one way or another with the legacy of the New Deal. So it's really part of the fabric of our lives, and it's something that warrants reinvestment. The second reason the New Deal matters is I think that the mobilization of the American people to improve the economy in the 1930s is a resource that we can draw on. It's certainly the largest and the most successful, if not the only, example of mobilizing people and articulating a sense of American patriotism for a peaceful purpose, a purpose of actual construction.
Well, Americans have often resisted the notion of a strong central government, a strong federal government, and yet Franklin Delano Roosevelt seemingly got many Americans, because he won over and over again. How did he get Americans to accept that?
Well, Roosevelt was able to show that government could work for the ordinary American. His immediate policies on being elected ended the banking crises that had plagued the country really for the last 4 years, but that had accelerated in the few months before he took office. He was able to restore Americans' faith in the banks, in the United States currency, in the dollar, by taking control of those procedures and institutions from Washington, D.C. And that bought him a lot of goodwill to go forward and show what government could do in other areas. I think that good policy can turn out to be good politics.
How would you compare what President Biden has accomplished so far?
Well, I think you can make a direct analogy to the early days of Roosevelt's presidency. President Biden has come in and has immediately delivered on his campaign promises to improve management of the pandemic, get vaccinations rolling at higher rates than the ones he actually promised. And I've certainly heard from an awful lot of friends and acquaintances that when they go to these vaccine facilities and they see government in action, they kind of feel that their faith in our ability to do things through our politics has been restored.
And do you see President Biden's infrastructure proposal as an extension of the New Deal, a revision of the New Deal?
Yes, I think that the president's infrastructure plan as it stands now echoes a lot of New Deal programs. It's important to remember that the New Deal wasn't merely or even chiefly a recovery program for the economic downturn, but it was a program to rebuild the American economy. It included investment in electrical infrastructure, in hydroelectric, or what we would now call green infrastructure, in road building, in public transportation, in schools, in institutions for the disabled, and for other sort of parts of the American economy that would allow Americans to see that, again, we were able to work for ourselves through our political institutions to create a better life.
Now, President Biden won in large measure or a significant degree because of the African American vote. Was it Roosevelt that really caused or brought about that seismic shift of African American voters' allegiance to the Democratic Party?
Yes, that's right. The bulk of black voters switched to voting for Democrats during Franklin Roosevelt's first term. So historically, black voters had tended to cast their ballots for Republicans because of the legacy of the party of Lincoln. But their loyalty to Republican administrations had waned through the 1920s because Republicans like Herbert Hoover were trying to pick up white Southern votes. On the other hand, most black voters didn't switch to voting Democratic in the 1932 election because, of course, a large number of Democrats were white Southerners who perpetuated Jim Crow and disfranchisement and whose votes depended on the all-white primaries in Southern states. It wasn't until black voters saw the New Deal in action during Roosevelt's first term that they began to switch in large numbers and indeed as a majority population towards voting for Democrats. And there's an immense sea change of black voters' preferences for Democrats over the course of Roosevelt's first term. And that's because the public works programs of the New Deal did provide good work at good wages for black people, at least as long as the public works programs were administered out of Washington. So when you had programs that were administered by Harry Hopkins, like the Works Progress Administration, as a matter first of policy and later of law, they were forbidden from discriminating on the basis of race in hiring. When you had the Public Works Administration, which was administered by Harold Ickes out of the Department of Interior in Washington, they had a black economist named Robert Weaver, who would later become the first African-American cabinet secretary in American history, devising a program to prevent discrimination in hiring. Weaver believed it was successful as well. Now, it's also true that because of that southern wing of the Democratic Party, that when New Deal programs were administered in the South, they did tend to be segregated or indeed discriminatory. It's also true that when New Deal programs like the housing program were outsourced to private entities like real estate agents, they did perpetuate and even extend segregation in housing. But on balance, black voters stayed with the Democratic Party and the New Deal because, on balance, the Roosevelt administration kept pushing in the direction of furthering rights for African Americans. This probably culminated in the latter part of Roosevelt's first term when the Justice Department established what was first known as the Civil Liberties Unit and later became known as the Civil Rights Section and later the Civil Rights Division to bring cases to the Supreme Court to ensure voting rights for Black Americans. So there's a long story, of course, about the Democratic Party becoming the party of civil rights, at least at the national level. And it begins right there in Franklin Roosevelt's first term.
Well, we can't thank you enough for enlightening us and enriching us with respect to the parallels, if any, of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and President Joseph Biden, particularly in his first 100 days. And we're all that much richer for understanding it thanks to your book, The New Deal Matters. So thank you so very much for participating in State of Play.
Thank you very much for having me.
Welcome back to State of Play. Our topic today, the first 100 days of the presidency of President Joe Biden. To put it in historical context, though, we have with us an exceptional historian, Dr. Peniel Joseph. He is the professor of public affairs, occupies the Barbara Jordan Chair for Ethics and Political Values at the University of Texas at Austin. What a privilege to have you with us.
Wonderful to be here, Mayor Pratt.
And you have written many books, the most recent of which is The Sword and the Shield, the revolutionary lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Why did you make that book a composite of these two figures in American history, and how might that suggest what is going on today?
Well, I think that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. are the two most important Black political leaders of the 20th century. And I wanted to write a book that showed their shared symmetry rather than their differences. Malcolm and Martin are the most important Black, not just civil rights leaders, but revolutionary humanists of the 20th century. Malcolm X's notion of radical Black dignity influences Dr. King's notion of radical Black citizenship and vice versa. So rather than seeing them as polar opposites, we see them as dual sides of the same revolutionary coin that absolutely have impacted the Black Lives Matter movement in the 21st century.
Well, the civil rights movement took center stage, really, in America in the early 60s and undoubtedly animated the presidencies of both Kennedy, who was ultimately assassinated, and then President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Would you suggest that they ended up having a profound impact on those presidencies?
Absolutely. Civil rights really transforms President Kennedy's entire administration, from the Freedom Rides to Birmingham in 1963 to the March on Washington. And in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society really has civil rights as the centerpiece of that great society. The July 2nd Civil Rights Act would not have been passed without the civil rights movement. And certainly the Voting Rights Act passed on August 6, 1965. So when we think about presidencies and social movements, the Biden administration is in good company on that score.
Well, I don't know how you would evaluate it, but I have to speak to this. Lyndon Baines Johnson ended up, possibly because of the assassinations of Kennedy and King, becoming a very consequential president. And I was a student at Howard University when he came to provide his commencement address there in 1965 and talked of the Voting Rights Act. That was a moment I'll never forget. It was really extraordinary.
Well, Mayor Pratt, that June 4th, 1965 commencement speech is one of the best presidential speeches in American history, where President Johnson defines racial equality and equity not just as opportunity, but as outcomes. And that's the same struggle that Black Lives Matter and racial justice proponents are advocating today.
So, Professor Joseph, when you look at what President Biden is confronting and you compare that to what President Johnson was confronting, what's similar, what's different in your view?
Well, Karen, I would say what's similar is the racial upheavals in the 1960s and in the 21st century. So we did have racial rebellions. We did have police violence against Black communities. What's really dissimilar is, one, the numbers of whites who are part of the racial justice protest in the United States, 15 to 26 million last year. And what's also different is the dangers of anti-democracy that we are facing. In the 1960s, we didn't have a whole party that was supporting voter suppression, that was allying with white nationalists and white supremacists. In the 21st century, we do. And we see white supremacists have infiltrated law enforcement in the United States and the military. President Biden became the first president in American history to use the terms white supremacy at an inaugural address. So we are facing, I would argue, the most dangerous time in American history since President Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address in March of 1865, when, by the way, the Civil War was still being fought. General Lee would not surrender at the Appomattox Courthouse until the next month. And the 13th Amendment was not ratified until December of 1865. And of course, Lincoln was assassinated in April of that year.
So when you've reflected on the recent insurrection on January 6th, you've said history's not repeating itself, but it rhymes. What do you mean by that?
Well, we've seen this before. Wilmington, 1898, and a white riot that displaced a duly elected interracial government. We've seen white-led riots in the early 20th century in Atlanta, 1906, in Chicago, 1919, Tulsa, 1921, Rosewood, Florida, 1923. So we've seen white violence being used for political ends throughout American history. So the January 6th, 2021 white supremacist riot on the US Capitol was nothing new. It's the first time such a riot has been witnessed by the entire world.
Good to see you, Brother Professor, and thank you for joining us. Would you separate or delineate between January 6th and some of the other things we've seen? Would you delineate that from the police riots or police violence that is ongoing here in America when it comes to our people?
You know, I would say yes, and it converges. So the distinction with January 6th and the police violence and the police riots that have historically suppressed Black citizenship and dignity is that what you saw on January 6th was a grassroots white supremacist uprising that converged with law enforcement. They took selfies with law enforcement, but at the same time, they attacked certain law enforcement that tried to prevent them from doing violence in the Capitol. When we think about the police riots historically, Mark, they go back to racial slavery and the fact that slave patrols were the first institutionalization of law enforcement in American history. And that by the 1960s, with the Safe Streets Act in 1968, it's really part of the Great Society as well, we have the federal government gets into the crime control business. So the war on poverty becomes a war on crime. So we continue to see police rioting. We had about 150,000 police officers in the 1960s. We have over 800,000 now and 18,000 police departments. So policing in the United States, especially since the Great Society, has been used to safeguard the color line and the racial exploitation of Black people.
You speak of 3 reconstructions. I gather we're in the 3rd reconstruction. Are you optimistic about it, and will it take forever?
I am optimistic, Mayor Pratt, and I think that what's extraordinary about these previous periods of Reconstruction, they all lasted about 3 decades. I would argue that this one started in 2008, so we have quite a ways to go. I think this is the first time during any of these reconstructions that we've had the specific amount of white allies who've hit the streets with Black, brown, Latinx, queer, women, activists, young people in American history. And I also think this is the first time that when we think about these calls to defund the police or abolish prisons, that people are paying attention, whether they agree or not. They're recognizing that this is a cry of the heart. Black people historically have been at the cutting edge of democracy, and this is the first time they're being recognized as leaders. And I might add that Black women are playing a significant role here, as they always have. But when we think about Vice President Kamala Harris and Stacey Abrams, they are absolutely trying to save American democracy. Black women have historically bled for American democracy domestically and internationally, and they have been some of the biggest architects of small d democratic hopes in the world. And it's encouraging when you see Black women being greeted and embraced in the way they are. That gives me huge optimism, because unless we center Black women and queer folks and the poorest within our community, we're never going to reach the beloved community.
Well, you have really helped us get a better grasp of it in the context of Lyndon Baines Johnson, Kennedy, and Abraham Lincoln. Thank you so very much for joining us today on State of Play.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
The American Negro, acting with impressive restraint, has peacefully protested and marched, entered the courtroom and the seats of government, demanding a justice that has long been denied.
Welcome back to State of Play. Karen, Mark, and I have been reflecting on the first 100 days of President Joe Biden's. And so we've had some rich conversations from four extraordinary historians. We've had Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr., who provided us the historical arc around the Black Power movement and the struggle around race throughout the history of America. We've had Professor Kate Mazur, who is an expert on Reconstruction and therefore very much zeroes in on the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. We had Professor Eric Rauchway, who talked about FDR. He's a great expert there and really provided extraordinary insights on some of his policies and the implications of his policies for the African American community. And then we had Professor Peniel Joseph, who is quite the expert on Lyndon Baines Johnson and particularly the confluence of events with the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, as well as Johnson's role in American history. Three very consequential presidents. And so we obviously think that's where President Joe Biden is going to go. And that's where he seems determined to go.
Well, I think you're right, Mayor. And, you know, it's been amazing listening to these historians give us the context. But even if we look at the more traditional scales, you know, Joe Biden has done a lot. Vaccinations alone, money in people's pockets who really need it with the relief bill. You know, but he's also done a lot through executive order to undo what President Trump has done, ending the Muslim ban. And just on a human scale, right? He has lowered the temperature. He has lowered the rhetoric. There is no hate speech coming from the Oval Office. And that's just a welcome relief.
And in addition to that, other consequential things, infrastructure, which even some Trump supporters you would think would support, because that is something that will create shovel-ready jobs throughout America as we recover from this pandemic. Other things he did that weren't expected. $5.3 billion pledged in that infrastructure bill to go to gun violence interrupters, community organizations that are working to end gun violence on the ground, where a lot of that work really has to take place. A commission to study the expansion of the Supreme Court, pledging to cut the nation's greenhouse gas or carbon emissions in half by 2030, re-entering the Paris Climate Accords, bringing Iran back to the table in terms of nuclear disarmament. Free college tuition is on the table. Biden is also against ongoing qualified immunity for police officers. So I think he's proven that he's trying to emulate FDR's first 100 days.
Well, yes, probably FDR, probably Lincoln, as well as Lyndon Baines Johnson, because he recognizes that he really has quite a full table, and he is determined to address these issues in a way that will leave this country stronger and more united. And I think that he's got a great team that's hit the ground running. But of course, he still has a lot of challenges ahead of him. But this conversation today with these terrific historians has definitely enlightened us all. So I'm so glad you were here with us on State of Play.